The night Yoon Ji-Won lost her billionaire inheritance, she didn't lose because of a business failure. She lost everything because she chose the man she loved. Standing inside her family's grand mansion, surrounded by wealth and power, she was forced to choose between billions and John Stones, the man her family believed was beneath her. With tears in her eyes, she walked away from the only life she had ever known. She had no money, no family, no safety net, but she had love. And years later, the same family who turned their backs on her would come searching for the one person who could save them. The grand ballroom of the Shilla Hotel hummed with the delicate clinking of crystal and the low murmur of Korea's elite. Tonight was supposed to be the coronation of a dynasty. Everywhere you looked, diamonds caught the light, and powerful tech executives raised their glasses in anticipation. They were all there to witness the perfect merger, not just of two multi-billion-dollar semiconductor fortunes, but of Yoon Ji-Won and Daniel Park. Daniel stood near the stage, smooth, polished, and wearing the confident smile of a man who knew he was inheriting the world. Then, the heavy double doors opened, and a sudden, suffocating silence swept through the room. Ji-Won stepped onto the polished marble floor. She looked breathtaking, but she wasn't looking at Daniel. Her fingers were tightly laced through the hand of the man beside her. John Stones stood tall, his broad shoulders squared against the judgmental glares of 100 billionaires. As an African-American research fellow, he knew he didn't fit into their insular world, yet his gaze remained steady, holding Ji-Won up with silent, unwavering strength. Together, they walked past the frozen crowds and stepped right onto the main stage. Chairman Yoon Min-jae slowly rose from his seat at the head table. The air in the room grew ice-cold. His eyes locked onto John, then drifted down to their joined hands. The old man's face hardened, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "Who is this?" Ji-Won squeezed John's hand, drawing strength from his calm warmth. She looked her father dead in the eye. "The man I love." A collective gasp rippled through the ballroom. Daniel's smile vanished, replaced by a dark, humiliated sneer. Chairman Yoon's knuckles turned white against the edge of the table. He didn't just see a stranger. He saw a threat to the family legacy, a defiance he could not allow. Walking up to the stage, the patriarch delivered his ultimatum, his voice vibrating with absolute authority. "You have two choices, Ji-Won. Stand beside Daniel, retain your shares, and take your rightful place as the future leader of Yoon Microsystems. Or walk out of those doors with him and leave with absolutely nothing." Ji-Won looked at John. She saw the quiet vulnerability in his dark eyes, the silent reassurance that he would understand if she chose safety. But she also saw a man who valued her mind, her heart, and her freedom. She looked back at her father, reached down, and slowly pulled the priceless family signet ring from her finger. She placed it on the podium. "I would rather build a life with someone who believes in me," she said clearly, "than inherit one built without me." The retaliation was swift and merciless. By morning, the Yoon family machinery had erased her. Her billions in shares were instantly canceled. Her name was scrubbed from the corporate registry. The media launched a brutal smear campaign, painting her as an unstable heiress. Her own brother, Ji-hoon, stood before a wall of flashing cameras and coldly declared, "She gave up everything for a stranger." In their tiny, drafty apartment, above a noisy convenience store, the glittering world they left behind felt 1,000,000 miles away. John sat on the edge of their second-hand bed, his head in his hands. "I destroyed your future, Ji-Won," he whispered, the guilt heavy in his voice. Ji-Won walked over, kneeling in front of him, and pulling his hands away from his face. She smiled, her eyes fierce with devotion. "You didn't take me away from my future, Ji-Won. You became part of it." They married the next week, in a quiet, empty chapel. But love couldn't stop the cold reality of the world. 6 months later, the heavy hammer fell. John walked through the door, his face pale, His research funding had been abruptly cancelled. Minutes later, Ji-Won logged into her network, only to find her credentials revoked. A contact whispered the truth over the phone. Every major semiconductor company on the planet had officially blacklisted them. They were completely broke, entirely isolated, and the industry was shutting its doors on them forever. Winter in Busan arrived with a bitter, unforgiving chill that leaked straight through the thin walls of their tiny apartment. The blacklist had stripped away their names, their careers, and their security, leaving them to fight for survival on the icy streets. John spent his nights on a battered scooter, delivering food through freezing rain, his hands shaking so violently from the cold he could barely grip the handlebars. Ji-Won, who once ran elite research teams, spent her days tutoring ungrateful teenagers for pennies. To pay for electricity, they sold what little they had left. First went Ji-Won's designer coats, then her watch, and finally the diamond earrings her mother had secretly given her. Yet, poverty couldn't touch the quiet warmth inside their walls. On the night of their first wedding anniversary, their bank accounts were entirely empty. They couldn't afford a proper dinner, so they sat on the linoleum floor, sharing a single container of cheap convenience store ice cream with 2 plastic spoons. John looked at her, his heart aching with an apology he couldn't voice. But Ji-Won just laughed, leaning her head against his shoulder. In that drafty room, stripped of all luxury, they realized they were happier than they had ever been in their gilded pasts. That happiness became the fuel for their defiance. Working under the dim light of a single desk lamp, John poured his frustration into his notebook, finally uncovering a revolutionary semiconductor process that could alter data transmission forever. He had the brilliant engineering, but Ji-Won had the corporate strategy. Together, they stayed up until dawn, transforming his raw equations into a lethal business model. With the last of their meager savings, they rented a crumbling, unheated warehouse on the outskirts of the city. They hung a cheap plastic sign on the rusted door, Aurion Semiconductor, but the world outside refused to forget where they came from. When they pitched their prototype to venture capitalists, the rejections weren't just financial, they were deeply personal. In a high-rise office overlooking the city, a wealthy investor slid their proposal back across the table with a sneer. "You were born wealthy and still managed to fail, Ms. Yoon. Why would we trust you?" Another billionaire looked right past John, his voice dripping with condescension. "The world doesn't need a disgraced heiress and a foreign engineer playing scientist." The humiliation stung, but it didn't break them. Instead of quitting, they risked everything, draining their final emergency funds to build a working prototype. The company hovered on the brink of total bankruptcy for weeks, the threat of losing the warehouse looming over their heads. Then, a lifeline appeared. A mid-sized Japanese tech manufacturer took a massive gamble and agreed to test their technology. The day of the test, John and Ji-Won stood huddled around a single computer screen in the freezing warehouse, holding their breath as the data transferred. The progress bar hit 100%. The screen flashed bright green. The architecture worked perfectly. It was faster and more efficient than anything Yoon Microsystems had ever built. John let out a breathless laugh, wrapping his arms tight around Ji-Won as tears pricked her eyes. They had done it. But before they could even celebrate, the warehouse telephone rang, shattering the moment. A panicked voice on the other end delivered a crushing blow. Victor Lee, the ruthless CEO of Titancore Technologies, had just bought out their main silicon wafer supplier. With a single signature, Victor had severed Aurion's supply chain. They had a world-changing technology, but suddenly, they were completely unable to manufacture a single piece of it. Victor Lee's assault was swift, cold, and calculated to suffocate Aurion before it could draw another breath. Within weeks, the Titancore billionaire systematically poached their few remaining technicians with double salaries, spread malicious rumors through tech blogs that their patents were stolen, and quietly pressured independent investors to blackball them entirely. The warehouse grew emptier by the day, the silence weighing heavy in the dusty air. Ji-Won felt a familiar, suffocating panic tightening around her chest. Desperate to protect John from losing everything, she sat at the wooden desk one night, staring at a buyout contract from a predatory firm. "Maybe we should sell," she whispered, her voice cracking, "before we lose everything." John walked over, gently taking the pen from her trembling fingers. He knelt beside her, his warm hands cupping her face, forcing her to look into his steady eyes. "We didn't build this because it was easy, Ji-Won. We built it because it's ours. Nobody buys us out." But the scars of her past ran deep. When a legitimate, independent technology collective offered a fair joint venture, Ji-Won's pride and deep-seated fear of outside manipulation took over. Terrified of losing control of her destiny again, she stubbornly rejected the partnership. The mistake was immediate and catastrophic. Without the collective's capital, their manufacturing lines froze, and their bank accounts rapidly drained to zero, pushing Aurion to the literal brink of bankruptcy. That night, the tension inside the warehouse finally snapped. John challenged her, his voice raw but filled with intense love. "You left your family because they controlled you, Ji-Won. Now you're letting the fear of being controlled ruin everything we fought for. Don't let fear become your new prison." His words pierced right through her defenses. Standing in the dim light, she realized she was acting like her father, sacrificing their future just to maintain absolute control. She nodded, letting go of her pride, and tightly threw her arms around him. The next morning, they pivoted. They accepted strategic, collaborative partnerships, trading minority shares for heavy manufacturing muscle. The momentum changed instantly. The crumbling warehouse was soon replaced by a gleaming, high-tech factory floor, which rapidly expanded into an international operation. Aurion was no longer just a startup. It was an unstoppable force. Meanwhile, across the city, the dynasty that discarded her was bleeding. Yoon Microsystems was suffocating under the insecure, short-sighted leadership of Ji-Won's brother, Ji-Hoon, whose outdated business models failed to compete with Titan Core's aggressive maneuvers. Deep within the quiet library of the Yoon mansion, Chairman Min Jae sat alone in the dark, secretly watching international tech panels on his tablet. He stared at the screen, watching his daughter speak with an elegant authority and profound brilliance that he had foolishly cast aside. His hand shook slightly, but his stubborn pride kept his phone silent. He never called. Then came the day that changed the global tech landscape forever. Aurion Semiconductor officially cut the ribbon on its first billion-dollar mega facility, cementing its place as an industry titan. For the first time, the international media unmasked the brilliant minds behind the empire. Sitting in his corporate office, Chairman Yoon froze as the television screen flashed to life, showcasing his daughter's proud, smiling face, standing shoulder to shoulder with John Stone's. The world finally knew exactly who she was. Years passed, and the name Aurion became synonymous with global dominance. The tiny company born in a freezing warehouse now commanded a massive piece of the international market. Ji-Won and John were official billionaires, their names plastered across global financial magazines. Yet, the wealth didn't change the quiet intimacy between them. They still walked hand in hand, and instead of buying yachts or islands, they poured their vast fortune back into the people. They funded massive scholarships for minority students, supported independent engineers, and created opportunities for outsiders who, like John once had, just needed someone to believe in them. They remained anchored in their love, a rock untouched by the swirling madness of their immense wealth. But while Aurion soared, the Yoon family empire was bleeding to death. Yoon Microsystems was in a state of absolute collapse. Suffocated by Ji-Hoon's outdated technology models and catastrophic leadership decisions, the company was drowning. Victor Lee saw his moment to strike. Launching a ruthless, final offensive, Titan Core Technologies began a hostile takeover. squeezing the family company's stock and leaving them with zero options. The proud Yoon dynasty was facing total, humiliating extinction. Inside the dark boardroom of the Yoon mansion, the atmosphere was suffocating. Ji-hoon sat with his head buried in his hands, his fragile ego completely shattered under the weight of his failure. "It's my fault," he choked out, the reality finally crushing him. Chairman Min-jae stood by the high window, looking older and more fragile than he ever had before. For the first time in his entire life, the patriarch's fierce pride crumbled. He stared out into the city, his voice a hollow, trembling whisper. "I spent my entire life protecting this company, and I forgot the only person who actually had the brilliance to save it." The following morning, the Yoon Emergency Board of Directors met in a panic. Their financial analysts had reached a brutal, unanimous conclusion. There was only one entity on the planet with the capital and the infrastructure to stop Titan Corp's hostile takeover: Aurion Semiconductor. Chairman Yoon was forced to face his ultimate nightmare. To save his life's work, he would have to swallow his legendary pride, crawl to the daughter he had brutally abandoned, and beg for her mercy. The day of the meeting arrived like a heavy, storm-soaked shadow. The Yoon family arrived at the towering glass and steel Aurion headquarters, their movements stiff with intense anxiety. They were escorted into a massive, pristine executive boardroom that overlooked the entire skyline of Seoul. Chairman Yoon, his wife Yoon Jung, and a shaking Ji-hoon sat on one side of the polished mahogany table, the silence in the room heavy enough to crack. Their future hung completely by a thread. Suddenly, the heavy electronic locks click-clacked open. The towering double doors swung inward. Every eye in the room locked onto the doorway, breath catching in their throats. Ji-Won stepped across the threshold, her presence radiating absolute power. And the family who had cast her out could only look up in stunned silence. The boardroom felt like an isolation chamber, as Victor Lee launched his final, desperate offensive. Sensing his grip slipping, the Titan Corp billionaire unleashed a wave of calculated chaos, attempting to manipulate skittish investors and weaponize old tabloid rumors about Ji-Won's past. He wanted panic. He wanted a stampede that would crush Aurion and Yoon Microsystems in one swift move. But Victor's money couldn't buy the one thing John and Ji-Won had spent years cementing: an unshakable reputation. Because they had always treated their partners with radical transparency and absolute loyalty, the global tech market refused to bite. The panic never came. Instead, the investors stood firm, leaving Victor exposed and bleeding capital. Just as the tide began to turn, a familiar ghost from the past emerged from the shadows. Daniel Park, desperate to reclaim a piece of the industry he'd been pushed out of, secretly aligned with Victor to feed Titan Corp confidential insider data. But John had built a security infrastructure that was virtually impenetrable. Daniel's digital footprints were caught within hours, his desperate corporate espionage exposed in glaring, undeniable light. When the evidence was laid bare before the Yoon family, the illusion finally shattered. The smooth, polished prince they had tried to force Ji-Won to marry was revealed as a hollow, opportunistic parasite. With Victor cornered and Daniel exposed, Ji-Won held absolute power in her hands. She had the financial leverage to completely annihilate Titan Corp, to bankrupt Victor Lee, and erase him from the tech world forever. The industry watchdogs braced themselves, expecting a bloodbath. Even her brother, Ji-hoon, whispered that she should crush them. But as Ji-won stood looking out over the city skyline, John walked up behind her, gently placing his hands on her shoulders. His silent warmth anchored her, reminding her of the cold, dark path they had walked away from years ago. She looked at John, and the anger inside her dissolved into absolute clarity. She chose mercy over malice. Instead of engaging in a dirty corporate war, Ji-won handed the mountain of evidence over to federal prosecutors, exposing Victor's corruption through the strict letter of the law. She refused to use her wealth to destroy people. If I use their tactics, she whispered to John, her voice steady and resolute, I become the exact thing that tried to break us. With Titan Core legally neutralized, Ji-Won finally turned her attention to the survival contract lying on the table before her biological family. She agreed to bail out Yoon Microsystems, pouring Aurion's massive capital into their failing lines, but she demanded absolute surrender on her terms. Her conditions were non-negotiable. Every single factory worker and low-level employee would retain their jobs with full benefits. Rigid family tradition would be permanently replaced by modern innovation, and future leadership would be determined strictly by raw ability, not bloodlines. Ji-Hoon would have to earn his seat, just like everyone else. Chairman Min-jae stared at the sweeping terms, realizing his daughter had just designed a company built on human value, the exact philosophy he had mocked her for. With a heavy, trembling hand, he picked up the pen, but just before his signature touched the paper, the old patriarch paused. He looked up at Ji-Won, his eyes clouded with genuine sorrow, his voice cracking under the weight of a decade of regret. I don't deserve your forgiveness, Ji-Won, but I hope someday I can finally earn it. The ink dried on the final contract, and with that single act, the landscape of the global tech industry shifted forever. The merger between Aurion and Yoon Microsystems wasn't a hostile swallowing of a beaten rival. It was a resurrection. Because of Ji-Won's unyielding conditions, the terrifying shadow of mass layoffs dissolved overnight. Thousands of factory workers, engineers, and everyday staff woke up to secure jobs, their livelihoods fiercely protected by the woman her family had once cast out. Powered by John's cutting-edge engineering and Ji-Won's brilliant human-first strategy, the newly unified Aurion Semiconductor soared, cementing its place as one of the largest, most dominant technology empires on the face of the earth. A few weeks after the paperwork was finalized, Ji-Won found herself standing inside the grand, echoing foyer of the old Yoon family home. The last time she had stood under these high ceilings, she had been stripped of her name, her dignity, and her fortune. Now, the heavy air felt different, stripped of its old, suffocating arrogance. Chairman Min-jae walked slowly down the marble hallway toward her. He looked smaller now, the harsh edge of the absolute dictator completely gone, replaced by the quiet humility of a father who had finally opened his eyes. Stopping before her, the old man reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. He opened it, revealing the heavy, priceless family signet ring, the exact token of inheritance Ji-Won had deliberately abandoned on the hotel podium all those years ago. Min-jae's hand shook slightly as he held it out to her. This always belonged to you, Ji-Won, he said softly, his voice thick with unexpressed emotion. It was never my right to take it. Ji-Won stared down at the glittering gold, the old memories rushing back in a brief, heavy wave. She slowly reached out, took the ring, and held it tightly in her palm. Then, she turned toward the polished mahogany table where John was waiting for her. Standing beside him, she picked up a small, encased glass box containing their very first semiconductor chip prototype. The raw, scratched piece of silicon they had built together in a freezing warehouse when they had absolutely nothing. With a serene, peaceful smile, Ji-Won placed the family ring right next to the prototype. She looked up at her father, her hand slipping naturally back into John's warm, solid grip. This ring represents exactly where I came from, she said clearly, her voice echoing in the quiet room. But this chip, this represents exactly where we are going. A few days later, Chairman Yoon Min-jae stood entirely alone on the high observation deck of Aurion's massive, state-of-the-art manufacturing facility. Years earlier, standing in his grand ballroom, he had looked his daughter in the eye and delivered a cruel prophecy, telling her she would never build anything greater than the family she was abandoning. Now, he looked down through the sweeping glass windows at a sprawling city of innovation. Below him, thousands of brilliant engineers from every background worked in perfect sync, driving the future of global technology forward. At the center of the massive floor stood Ji-Won, speaking animatedly with a team of young technicians, her presence commanding absolute respect and devotion from everyone around her. John stood just a step behind her, his hand resting supportively against the small of her back, the two of them moving as one unbreakable anchor. The old man pressed his hand against the glass, a tear finally slipping down his weathered cheek. He watched his daughter lead an empire built not on fear, control, or pure greed, but on absolute loyalty and human connection. He closed his eyes, swallowed the last remnants of his old pride, and quietly whispered into the empty air, "I was wrong." She had once thought that choosing love meant losing everything she had ever known. But the man her family had rejected helped her build something far greater than mere wealth, a living, breathing legacy that no family name could ever create.